Cops mock black woman in court, unaware she's the Homeland Security chief. A tense silence settled over the courtroom as the defendant, a poised black woman dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, stepped forward. Two smirking police officers sat at the prosecution's table, exchanging amused glances. They were confident, certain they would put her in her place, certain that this trial would end in their favor. What they didn't realize was that she was no ordinary defendant. Soon, the balance of power would shift so dramatically that it would leave everyone in shock. Secrets, prejudice, and an impending reckoning hung thick in the air. This was about to become the most explosive case the city had ever witnessed. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering windows of the Marston County Courthouse, casting long shadows on the polished floors. The hushed whispers of reporters lined the vast hallway, cameras and notepads at the ready. Most assumed this was just another routine case, but there was an unspoken tension in the air, an electricity that no one could quite place. Spectators arrived in droves, packing the courtroom to capacity. Even the bailiffs seemed unusually wary, as if sensing an undercurrent of something much bigger than the trial itself. At the center of it all stood Elise Morgan, a refined black woman in her 40s. She carried herself with quiet confidence. Her high cheekbones and sharp, knowing gaze gave nothing away. Dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, she exuded an air of authority that left many perplexed. She had no media circus, no high-profile entourage. Only her legal counsel, Gregory Holtz, a seasoned attorney with salt and pepper hair, and a neatly dressed assistant who remained discreetly in the background. Elise moved with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what was coming. At the prosecution's table, officers Mark Ridley and Dave Thompson of the Westbridge Police Department sat with smug expressions. Ridley, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his confidence evident. Thompson, younger and sharper, had an air of arrogance, his smirk barely contained. The two had built a reputation in certain communities, particularly in low-income and minority neighborhoods, for their heavy-handed tactics. "I've got a feeling this one's going to be easy," Thompson muttered. Ridley chuckled. "It always is when they think they can outsmart us." Judge Pamela Whitfield, her black robe carrying the full weight of the law, adjusted her glasses as she flipped through a stack of files. The quiet rustling of papers and the occasional movement of court staff filled the otherwise silent room. Though she gave no outward sign, there was something in her gaze that suggested she sensed the unusual tension in the air. Elise had been charged with obstruction of a police investigation. According to official reports, she had interfered with an active operation conducted by Ridley and Thompson weeks earlier, leading to a confrontation that resulted in her arrest. However, the details of the incident had been kept vague. Now, as Elise sat at the defendant's table, her hands folded neatly before her, it was clear there was far more to the story than anyone had been led to believe. She was calm, but a keen observer would notice the subtle tension in her jaw, the only hint that she took these proceedings very seriously. Yet in her posture, there was no fear. Today, the city of Westbridge would learn something no one, least of all the arrogant officers at the prosecution's table, had seen coming. As the bailiff finally called the court to order, the world seemed to hold its breath. The trial was about to begin, and no one in that courtroom was prepared for what was about to unfold. The courtroom settled into an uneasy quiet as Judge Whitfield addressed the jury, a diverse but unreadable mix of men and women. Some seemed indifferent, still shaking off morning fatigue, while others leaned forward, intrigued. They knew, perhaps instinctively, that this would not be an ordinary case. Assistant District Attorney Colleen Marshall, leading the prosecution, rose with a confident air. Her opening statement painted Elise Morgan as a reckless individual who had deliberately obstructed law enforcement. Though her tone remained professional, there was a subtle condescension in her words, as if Elise's actions had been impulsive rather than calculated. Ridley and Thompson exchanged approving glances as Marshall emphasized their dedicated service to the city. Across the room, Elise sat quietly, studying the jury. She recognized the flickers of unconscious bias in their expressions. The pursed lips, the slight shifts in posture whenever her name was mentioned. She had spent enough years in high-stakes environments to know how to read a room. Then Gregory Holtz, her defense attorney, stood. Though age had etched lines into his face, his presence commanded the room. A legend in Westbridge's legal circles, Holtz had built his career on dismantling injustice. His voice, calm and deliberate, carried across the room as he promised the jury a much clearer picture of what had really happened that day. And as the first witness was called, Elise's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile. The truth was about to come out, and it would change everything. Holtz also hinted that unique circumstances surrounding his client should make everyone question the narrative officers Ridley and Thompson had been spinning for weeks. For days, you've only heard the prosecution's version of events in the media, he said, meeting the eyes of each juror. You've been told that Ms. Morgan obstructed a police operation, but I urge you keep an open mind. You'll see that officers Ridley and Thompson didn't just follow standard procedure. They employed unlawful methods, used intimidation tactics, and targeted Ms. Morgan for reasons that extend far beyond proper policing. At the mention of unlawful conduct and intimidation, the officers shifted slightly in their seats. Ridley's smug grin faltered, just for a moment, before he masked it with a sneer. Thompson, drumming his fingers on the table, let a flicker of irritation cross his face. Once opening statements concluded, Judge Whitfield declared a short recess before the first witness would be called. The tension in the room had a chance to breathe. The prosecution huddled at a side bench, whispering in hushed tones. Ridley shot Elise a derisive glance, mouthing something that could have been an insult. Thompson simply smirked. Meanwhile, Elise sat in quiet conversation with Gregory. To any observer, she looked like just another well-dressed defendant, occasionally exchanging polite smiles with her counsel. But beneath her composed exterior, she could feel the surge of adrenaline each time the officers muttered under their breath. It took every ounce of self-control not to expose the truth right then and there. Instead, she watched, waiting to see just how far Ridley and Thompson would take their performance before the truth shattered their facade. In the hallway, a few reporters snapped photos as Elise made her way to the water fountain. She offered no comment, just a polite nod and a slight raise of her hand. At her side, her assistant, Tiana, a discreet young woman with a keen eye for detail, kept watch, ensuring the press didn't get too intrusive. Tiana knew exactly what was happening. She knew who Elise Morgan truly was. This trial wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about exposing a pattern of corruption and racial bias deeply rooted in certain parts of the police force. The city deserved better, and Elise was determined to see justice done. As the judge's gavel signaled the end of the recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom tightened once again. Gregory stood, ready to call his first witness. The prosecution, still radiating confidence, sat as if they held every card in the deck. Elise took a deep breath, her gaze locking onto Ridley and Thompson. Their reckoning was coming, and soon, the entire courtroom and the entire city would witness just how quickly arrogance and prejudice could crumble in the face of undeniable truth. Before the first witness was called, Gregory requested permission to present footage from the day of Elise's arrest. Judge Whitfield granted the motion. The courtroom dimmed, and all eyes turned to the large screens mounted on the walls. The grainy black and white surveillance footage showed a quiet residential street in Westbridge on a late afternoon. Several police vehicles lined the curb outside a modest home, officers moving about, some taking notes, others standing guard. Then, the camera's angle shifted, revealing Ridley and Thompson approaching a woman on the sidewalk, Elise Morgan. Dressed casually, she appeared to be returning from a community event. Though the footage had no audio, body language told the story clearly. Elise stood composed yet concerned, gesturing as though asking the officers questions, likely about their presence in her neighborhood. Ridley and Thompson's exaggerated arm movements made them appear dismissive, perhaps even aggressive. Elise lifted her palms in a defensive manner, taking a step back. The conversation escalated. Then, suddenly, Thompson yanked out a pair of handcuffs and lunged. Ridley loomed close, his stance unmistakably threatening. A thick silence fell over the courtroom. Elise remained outwardly calm, but her eyes flickered. For many on the jury, this was their first real look at the encounter. If Elise had truly obstructed an operation, the footage didn't seem to show it. Instead, it showed her being surrounded, cornered, and restrained. The defense froze the video at the moment Elise was pinned against a police cruiser, her arms wrenched behind her back in cuffs. Gregory's voice was steady as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this footage is only the beginning. What do you see here?" Ms. Morgan, calmly asking questions, stepping back. No sign of aggression, no interference. And yet, within moments, the situation escalates into force. The prosecution claims she was actively obstructing an operation. "But is that what you see?" Eddie Marshall cleared her throat, preparing to counter. But before she could, the lights came back on, and Gregory continued. "We will present eyewitness testimony from residents who saw what truly happened that day, including one neighbor who will confirm that Ms. Morgan's only concern was for a woman in that house, an elderly resident who had previously reported police harassment." After a brief sidebar, Judge Whitfield allowed the defense to proceed. The first witness was Carmen Williams, a retired schoolteacher and longtime neighborhood watch volunteer. She had been walking her dog when the arrest happened. Speaking with quiet conviction, she recalled how Elise approached the officers respectfully, simply asking what was going on. Carmen's voice trembled slightly. "She knew the woman living there," she explained. "An older lady, sweet as can be. That house had been raided before. She was scared. Elise just wanted to make sure she was okay." Carmen's jaw tightened. There was no shouting.
No threats. No interference.
She only asked a question. She hesitated, then added, her voice heavy with emotion. "They just grabbed her, and they called her all sorts of names." Carmen's voice wavered slightly as she continued, her expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "They muttered things under their breath. I can't repeat them in this courtroom," she said, her tone steady despite the weight of her words. But it was shocking. She did nothing but ask questions, and the next thing I knew, she was face down on that cruiser. At that moment, Ridley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Thompson's jaw tightened. Their expressions betrayed their urge to discredit this witness, but Carmen's unwavering tone and the sincerity in her eyes made her testimony difficult to dismiss. The jury took notes, occasionally glancing at Elise to gauge her reaction. When Marshall rose to cross-examine, she attempted to undermine Carmen's credibility. She hinted that Carmen's age might have affected her eyesight or that she could be personally biased. But Carmen remained firm, clarifying that she only needed reading glasses and had been a lifelong advocate for fair policing. She also recounted how the officers had mocked Elise, saying, "People like you shouldn't be meddling in grown folks' business." As Carmen finished her testimony, a ripple of unease passed through the prosecution's table. The possibility that racially charged language had been used added a new layer of complexity to the case. Ridley and Thompson avoided making eye contact with the jury as Carmen stepped down. For the first time since the trial began, cracks appeared in the officers' wall of arrogance. They exchanged a glance, then quickly looked away as Elise remained calm, quietly observing the proceedings. She still hadn't revealed her true identity. The stage was set for even more explosive revelations, ones that would shake not just the courtroom but the entire Westbridge Police Department. During the lunch recess, the courthouse corridors buzzed with speculation. Journalists huddled in corners, whispering theories about the surveillance footage and Carmen's testimony. Some recalled past rumors about Ridley and Thompson, complaints that were filed and mysteriously went nowhere. How many times had these officers escaped scrutiny? And who was Elise Morgan, that she would stand up to them so fearlessly? Elise and Gregory retreated to a small conference room, where her assistant, Tiana, guarded the door against prying ears. A hush fell as Gregory reviewed his notes. "Carmen's testimony was solid," he said, glancing at Elise with a nod of approval. "But they'll try to discredit her any way they can. We need more than just eyewitness accounts." He hesitated before adding, "At some point, we'll have to reveal who you really are." Elise exhaled slowly, straightening her posture. "We will," she said quietly. "But not yet. I need them to keep underestimating me. I want to see just how far they're willing to lie under oath." Gregory rubbed the bridge of his nose, considering the risk. "This is dangerous," he admitted. "The prosecution will throw everything they have at us. But if we reveal the truth at the right moment, it could turn the entire case upside down. Once the court realizes you're the newly appointed head of the Department of Homeland Security, those officers won't have anywhere to hide." Elise nodded. "Exactly. But this isn't just about winning my case. We need real accountability. If we expose them too soon, they might cut a deal, or the department could try to bury the evidence. Timing is everything." Tiana stepped forward, clearing her throat. "Ma'am, I've arranged a secure call with Deputy Secretary Lawson," she said. "He wants an update on the situation." Elise offered a brief, appreciative smile before turning back to Gregory. "Can we trust the system here to deliver justice once they learn who I am?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "I've seen bureaucracy move slowly, and sometimes in the wrong direction." Gregory leaned in, his gaze serious. "I've been fighting corruption in Westbridge for decades," he said. "I know how deep it runs. But the moment this becomes a federal issue, especially under Homeland Security's jurisdiction, they can't just sweep it under the rug. And if city officials try, they'll be looking at far bigger legal consequences. We're talking civil rights violations at the federal level." Elise's expression hardened. She knew the weight her position carried, but it frustrated her that she had to rely on such leverage just to ensure her own rights were protected. She thought about the people who didn't have the same power, the ones who had been pinned to police cruisers just like she had, but with no means to fight back. Meanwhile, in another corner of the courthouse, Ridley and Thompson sat huddled with ADA Marshall. Their voices were low but tense. "She's just an old bat," Ridley muttered, his frustration barely contained. "Carmen's testimony is hearsay. We need to make that clear." Thompson nodded in agreement. "Elise was the aggressor," he insisted. "She was using threatening language. We were just doing our job." But their confidence wavered slightly when Marshall narrowed her eyes. "Do you have any actual proof of that?" she asked sharply. Neither officer answered right away. The so-called dashcam footage had conveniently suffered technical issues. The body cameras they wore had either malfunctioned or run out of battery at just the right moments. Marshall exhaled sharply, lowering her voice. "Keep it together," she hissed. She knew that the repeated malfunctions would start looking suspicious. But for now, she had to maintain a united front. "We'll find a way to challenge that video," she said. "And even if the judge allows it, we'll bring in enough department witnesses to back up your version of events. We stick to our story." "Understood," Thompson muttered, though his voice wavered. "We have to win. I'm not letting some loudmouth troublemaker ruin my career." Ridley clapped a reassuring hand on his partner's shoulder. "Relax, Dave. We've been through worse," he said. "At the end of the day, no jury is going to believe some random civilian over two decorated officers, especially not someone like her." Marshall glanced over her shoulder and lowered her voice further. "Watch it with the remarks, Officer Ridley," she warned. "This case is already under scrutiny. We can't afford any slip-ups that suggest bias or prejudice." "Understood." Ridley gave a half-hearted shrug but nodded. His expression, however, betrayed neither regret nor caution. Their entire defense hinged on the assumption that no one could outmaneuver them in court. They had no idea who Elise truly was, or how far her influence extended beyond Westbridge. As the lunch recess ended, both sides prepared for the next round of proceedings. Elise returned to her seat, her posture composed, her expression unreadable. Thompson and Ridley shot her discreet but pointed glares. Above them, the grand clock on the courtroom wall ticked steadily, counting down to the moment when long-buried truths would finally erupt into the open, along with the arrogance of two officers who never imagined the tables could turn so drastically against them. When the court reconvened, Judge Whitfield called the session to order. The prosecution wasted no time in trying to reinforce their narrative, calling Officer Thompson to the stand. The young cop strode forward with confidence, his uniform immaculate, his gaze steady on the jury. He had rehearsed his testimony carefully, hoping it would serve as the key piece of evidence proving Elise Morgan's so-called obstruction. Thompson's version of events was meticulously crafted. He claimed Elise had approached them aggressively, demanding they stop their investigation. According to him, she shouted profanities and threatened to call her people, to force them to back off. He alleged that she then pushed him, leaving him no choice but to restrain her. Gregory rose for cross-examination, scanning a sheet of notes before meeting Thompson's gaze. "Officer Thompson," he began evenly, "you claim Miss Morgan physically shoved you. Can you point out where exactly that occurs in the surveillance footage we just reviewed?" Thompson squared his shoulders, his jaw tightening. "It wasn't caught on that camera," he replied. "It happened after she stepped out of view. You can't see it." Gregory arched an eyebrow. "Yet the footage clearly shows her backing away from you," he noted. "And within seconds, she's handcuffed. Are you suggesting that, in that extremely brief interval, one that just so happens to be off camera, she managed to push you?" Thompson sniffed and gave a curt nod. "She was quick. Cameras don't catch everything." A ripple of skeptical laughter passed through the spectators, only to be swiftly silenced by the judge's gavel. Thompson's face reddened slightly, but he maintained his stance. Gregory, unfazed, pressed further. "You mentioned a malfunction with your body camera," he continued. "Do you have any official documentation, maintenance logs, or reports that confirm this issue?" Thompson hesitated, then muttered, "There was a glitch. We reported it. The department's tech unit has the records." Gregory offered a polite, tight-lipped smile. "I see. We requested those logs, yet we haven't received them," he said, his tone measured. "I trust they'll be provided soon. Otherwise, we might have to question whether they exist at all." The jury took note of Thompson's evasiveness. He shifted in his seat, a sheen of sweat forming along his hairline. Sensing the tension, ADA Marshall shifted the focus, directing Thompson to speak about his years of service. She guided him through a narrative of his commendations and unwavering dedication to public safety. Thompson leaned into the performance, painting himself as a model officer, one who would have no reason to target an innocent civilian. Subtly, he implied that Elise, as a civilian, had no business interfering with police matters. Yet, beneath his words, an unmistakable arrogance seeped through. The jury noticed. After Thompson stepped down, Ridley was called to testify. The older officer sought to reinforce his partner's claims, but he added another layer, this time alleging that Elise had threatened to bring federal wrath down upon them. Gregory and Elise exchanged a brief, knowing glance. Ridley was getting dangerously close to the truth, without even realizing it. Yet his spin on the story sought to paint Elise as some delusional woman throwing around empty threats. The irony was palpable. He had no idea just how accurate that reference to federal wrath would soon become. When Gregory cross-examined, Ridley's explanation for the missing body cam footage was equally weak. He blamed a battery failure. Gregory narrowed his eyes. "How often do multiple body cameras malfunction simultaneously in a single operation?" he asked. Ridley crossed his arms, his posture growing defensive. "It happens," he grumbled. "These cameras aren't perfect." Throughout Ridley's testimony, Elise remained silent, her expression unreadable. She watched as the officers, so assured in their version of events, manipulated every detail to frame her as an aggressive troublemaker. The tension in the courtroom grew thick. Some spectators, especially those familiar with racial profiling, sat in stony silence. Others wore skeptical expressions, as if the officer's narrative was just a little too convenient. By late afternoon, after a grueling round of witness testimonies and cross-examinations, Judge Whitfield finally adjourned the session. "All parties should be prepared for additional evidence and witness statements tomorrow," she announced firmly. The trial was far from over, but the walls were already beginning to close in on Officers Ridley and Thompson. As the crowd filtered out of the courtroom that evening, the two officers exchanged relieved glances, convinced they had held their ground. However, ADA Marshall appeared less certain, noting the flickers of doubt creeping into the jury's expressions. Elise stepped outside with Gregory and Tiana by her side, grateful for the crisp evening air. Tomorrow, Gregory would begin to dismantle the officers' testimonies even further. And if necessary, Elise knew she had the means to deliver the blow that would turn the trial on its head. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person of color in Westbridge who had ever been silenced by those sworn to protect and serve. The following morning, an air of anticipation hung over the courthouse. Word had spread about the conflicting testimonies and the questionable body cam footage. Outside, crowds gathered, some holding signs demanding police accountability. The tension was no longer confined to the courtroom. It had spilled into the city itself. Inside, Gregory arrived early with Elise and Tiana. Elise immediately noticed a group of community leaders waiting near the benches. Among them stood Reverend Samuel Tillman, a respected clergyman known for his dedication to civil rights advocacy. The Reverend had heard whispers about Elise's case and decided it was time to show his support. Beside him stood an unexpected ally, Karen Donahue, a well-known conservative columnist who had long championed law and order policies. However, her stance had begun to shift after her teenage son was wrongfully stopped and frisked by the Westbridge PD. That incident had opened her eyes to the prejudice that many lived under every day. Gregory approached them, extending a polite handshake. "Reverend Miss Donahue, we appreciate you being here." Elise nodded in greeting, her stoic expression softening slightly at their presence. Seeing such unlikely allies standing together gave her hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the city was finally ready to confront its deep-seated issues. If only the truth was allowed to come to light. Once court was back in session, the defense called Dr. Yvonne Gardner, a clinical psychologist specializing in the psychological effects of racial profiling. As an expert witness, she testified about how repeated encounters with biased law enforcement erode trust in institutions, often leading marginalized communities to view police motives with skepticism. Elise watched the jury absorb Dr. Gardner's words, some nodding in quiet understanding. Throughout the psychologist's testimony, Ridley and Thompson exchanged irritated glances, their expressions growing darker by the minute. Although Gardner's testimony did not directly accuse them, it painted a broader picture, one that aligned uncomfortably with the very actions they stood accused of. It was a subtle yet effective maneuver by Gregory, helping the jury understand that Elise's reaction during her arrest wasn't about defiance. It was about years of systemic injustice. Then came a pivotal moment. Gregory called Sergeant Miguel Trevino of the Westbridge PD as a defense witness. Trevino was a man of few words, but his reputation as an honest officer was well known. Though initially hesitant, he had agreed to testify under subpoena. "Sergeant Trevino," Gregory began, his voice measured, "were you present at any point during the incident involving Miss Morgan?" Trevino gave a solemn nod. "Yes, I arrived shortly after the call for backup was made. I saw Miss Morgan in the back of a patrol car, handcuffed. She looked shaken." He paused, his eyes briefly flickering toward Ridley and Thompson. "I also noticed that their body cameras were powered off. When I asked if they had footage, they told me no." Gregory leaned in slightly. "Did that strike you as unusual?" Trevino hesitated for a moment before answering. "Yes, it did," he admitted. His gaze shifted warily toward the two officers, who were now glaring at him with open hostility. "Protocol requires body cams to be active during any interaction with the public. They told me it was a malfunction, but it seemed suspicious, especially since both had the exact same issue at the same time." Gregory pressed further. "Have you ever witnessed Officers Ridley or Thompson use excessive force or make racially charged remarks?" Trevino stiffened. Beads of sweat formed along his brow. Yes, he said at last, his voice quieter but firm. "I have heard them use slurs before. I've filed internal complaints, but nothing ever came of them." A hush fell over the courtroom. Ridley's face darkened with rage, while Thompson's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous, like a predator assessing its next move. ADA Marshall immediately attempted to discredit Trevino, suggesting he had personal grievances against the officers. But Trevino kept his responses brief and factual, refusing to be rattled. The damage, however, was already done. At the back of the gallery, Donahue furiously scribbled notes, while Reverend Tillman pressed his lips together in grim acknowledgement. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances, their expressions no longer neutral. Even Judge Whitfield's demeanor shifted slightly, as if she were only now beginning to grasp the true depth of the issue at hand. During a short recess, the hallway buzzed with murmured conversations. Some approached Trevino to thank him for his courage, while others whispered about the implications his testimony could have for the entire Westbridge PD. If Trevino's statements were backed by further evidence, it would be damning. Elise stood quietly beside Gregory, her thoughts racing. The tide was turning. Not long ago, Ridley and Thompson had sat smugly in the courtroom, convinced their badges granted them absolute impunity. Now, their foundation was beginning to crumble, undermined by their own lies and arrogance. But Elise knew this was only the beginning. The final, devastating blow would be her own identity, the revelation that she was the newly appointed head of Homeland Security. She harbored no illusions that exposing the truth would solve everything overnight. But it would force the entire system to confront what had happened. Justice was inching closer, but the battle was not over yet. By the end of the day, the prosecution, once so confident, was in shambles. One by one, the defense's witnesses had painted a damning portrait of misconduct. And with each passing moment, the officers' carefully constructed narrative unraveled further. It wasn't just Elise's arrest under scrutiny now. Earlier incidents involving Ridley and Thompson had also surfaced. The jury grew more attentive, some displaying expressions of disgust as disturbing details emerged about the officers' past interactions with minorities. Testimonies recounted traffic stops that escalated into unwarranted searches, young black men being roughed up for simply asking questions, and a consistent pattern of intimidation tactics. Elise and Gregory had carefully selected these witnesses, individuals who had either filed formal complaints or directly witnessed questionable policing. None of them had received justice, as their grievances had seemingly disappeared within the labyrinth of the Westbridge PD's internal affairs process. But now, under oath and with the public watching, these hidden truths could no longer be so easily dismissed. Tension escalated as Gregory presented departmental records obtained through a subpoena. These documents revealed that Ridley and Thompson had more misconduct complaints filed against them than 90% of their fellow officers. In the margins, multiple notes from Internal Affairs simply read, "Case closed, insufficient evidence." The pattern was undeniable. The prosecution attempted a weak rebuttal, arguing that officers working in high-crime areas naturally accumulated more complaints. But even the jury could see through this flimsy excuse. With each new revelation, Ridley and Thompson's credibility crumbled further. From the gallery, public opinion visibly shifted. Ridley grew increasingly withdrawn with every damning piece of evidence, while Thompson's expression occasionally contorted with anger. The same man who had once boasted about making short work of this woman was now grinding his jaw, his foot tapping anxiously beneath the table, a clear sign of mounting panic. Beyond the courthouse walls, local news channels broadcast daily updates. Community members voiced their outrage in interviews, particularly black residents who felt vindicated at last. Others, however, remained wary, warning against allowing one-sided stories to shape public perception, still clinging to the belief that law enforcement was beyond reproach. On social media, hashtags like #JusticeForElise and #WestbridgeTruth surged in popularity, trending locally as heated discussions erupted online. Gregory, now completely in his element, sensed the momentum shifting in their favor. But in a quiet moment, he offered Elise a warning. "We're on solid ground," he murmured. "But let's not underestimate the prosecution or the power structure in this city. I've seen last-minute attempts to bury the truth before. We need to stay vigilant." Elise nodded, fully aware of how fragile their progress was. Though she was eager to reveal her identity, she trusted Gregory's pacing. He wanted the jury and the public to absorb the full weight of the officer's misconduct before dropping the bombshell. That way, when they finally learned who she really was, the impact would be undeniable. That evening, Elise returned to her hotel suite, setting down her briefcase as she scanned through updates from Tiana. The Department of Homeland Security had authorized additional resources, should she need them. She also had a voicemail from Deputy Secretary Lawson, checking in on her well-being. A pang of bittersweet emotion passed through her. The top brass in Washington was ready to defend her, yet so many citizens in Westbridge lacked any such safety net. She gazed out at the city lights, her mind drifting back to her childhood in a small southern town, where she had first felt the sting of discrimination. She had vowed then to break barriers so that others wouldn't have to feel powerless. That promise had propelled her forward, leading her to rise through the ranks of law enforcement oversight, culminating in her appointment as the head of Homeland Security. And now, in a bitter twist of fate, she found herself on the receiving end of the very injustice she had spent her career fighting to dismantle. Still, despite everything, a small smile tugged at her lips. Things were changing. The truth was coming out. Tomorrow, they would continue chipping away at the prosecution's crumbling facade, bringing them ever closer to the moment of reckoning. Ridley and Thompson had no idea just how devastatingly their actions were about to backfire. And Elise was ready to deliver the justice that had been denied to so many for far too long. On the fourth day of the trial, the courthouse was more packed than ever. The line of people hoping to get inside stretched around the block. Both local and national news crews had descended, sensing a major story unfolding. Whispers circulated, something monumental was about to happen. Even the bailiffs were on high alert, scanning the crowd for any signs of disruption. Inside, court resumed with the defense's most crucial witness, Elise Morgan herself. The atmosphere crackled with tension as she stepped up to the witness stand. Every eye in the room fixed on her. Some doubted she had anything to add beyond personal testimony. Others, however, sensed she was about to drop a bombshell. Judge Whitfield instructed her to raise her right hand, and after swearing to tell the truth, she settled into the witness chair. Gregory began his questioning, his tone calm and composed, offering no hint of what was to come. "Miss Morgan, could you please tell the court about your background?" Elise folded her hands in her lap, her voice steady. "Certainly," she replied. "I grew up in South Carolina. My father was a pastor, and my mother was a school principal. We lived in a community deeply affected by racial discrimination, and from an early age, I saw firsthand how law enforcement could treat Black communities unfairly." A few jurors leaned forward, intrigued. Elise continued, her voice unwavering. "I pursued a double major in criminal justice and political science. After graduation, I joined a federal agency, initially the FBI, where I specialized in counterterrorism and later civil rights investigations. Over the years, and with that, the room braced for the revelation that would shake the trial and the city to its core. As Elise continued, she transitioned smoothly into the next part of her testimony. "I later moved to another federal agency, focusing on national security policy." She paused, glancing at Gregory. He gave her a small nod, encouraging her to continue. The gallery buzzed. Some spectators exchanged confused glances. Elise's credentials already far exceeded what they had assumed for a random defendant. Clearing her throat softly, she pressed on. "Eventually, I accepted a presidential appointment within the Department of Homeland Security. I served as Deputy Director of Intelligence before assuming my most recent position." A hush fell over the courtroom. Even Ridley and Thompson looked momentarily stunned. Gregory exhaled, preparing for the moment that would shift the entire trial. "And that most recent role is?" he asked, his voice measured. Elise met his gaze before turning to address the court directly. "I am currently the newly appointed head of the Department of Homeland Security." The silence was deafening, broken only by a few audible gasps. Camera shutters clicked as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. The jury sat frozen, mouths slightly agape. Judge Whitfield adjusted her glasses, as if doubting what she had just heard. Then chaos erupted. The gallery broke into murmurs and whispers. Ridley's eyes widened in sheer disbelief. Thompson went pale, as though the weight of his actions had just crashed down on him all at once. Eddie Marshall, to her credit, attempted to maintain her composure, but the slight tremor in her expression betrayed her shock. This was not just some random civilian on trial. This was one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. Gregory let the moment settle before continuing. So, Miss Morgan, on the day of your arrest, did you intend to interfere with a legitimate police operation? Or were you simply concerned about the legality of the raid in a neighborhood you were visiting? Elisa's voice remained steady. I had no intention of obstructing anything. I saw what appeared to be an overreach, and I was concerned about whether the rights of the homeowner were being violated. My concerns weren't personal, they were professional. My entire career has been dedicated to protecting citizens' rights while also ensuring national security. Another heavy silence filled the room. The jurors studied Elise carefully, trying to process the magnitude of her testimony. The prosecution sat visibly shaken, realizing this revelation had completely destroyed their portrayal of Elise as a disruptive meddler. Across the courtroom, Ridley and Thompson exchanged panicked glances. The woman they had manhandled, mocked, and dismissed as an annoyance was, in reality, one of the highest-ranking law enforcement officials in the country. The excuses they had concocted, their body cam malfunctions and standard procedures, now looked absurd under the scrutiny they were about to face from the highest levels of government. Ridley's fingers dug into the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning white. Thompson averted his gaze, unable to meet anyone's eyes. The arrogance they had once displayed was gone, replaced by a quiet, sinking dread. There was no undoing this. Elisa's truth was finally out, setting the stage for a dramatic reckoning. This case was no longer just about whether a civilian had obstructed a police operation. It was now about systemic discrimination, abuse of power, and racial injustice, exposed for the entire nation to see. And for Ridley and Thompson, the day of reckoning had arrived in a way they had never anticipated. The revelation that Elise was the newly appointed head of Homeland Security sent shockwaves through Westbridge and beyond. Within hours, the news dominated national headlines. Social media exploded with debates over the implications, while legal analysts speculated on how the case could reshape public trust in law enforcement. Civil rights organizations hailed Elise as a hero for exposing long-standing systemic issues. But no one felt the fallout more than the Westbridge Police Department. Suddenly, the entire chain of command found itself under intense scrutiny. Why had complaints against Ridley and Thompson repeatedly been dismissed? Who had ignored or even authorized their questionable tactics? The mayor's office scrambled to contain the PR disaster. The chief of police held a tense press conference, assuring the public that an internal investigation was already underway and pledging full cooperation with federal oversight. But skeptics weren't convinced. To them, these promises rang hollow, just another attempt to pacify public outrage without any real accountability. Meanwhile, for Ridley and Thompson, life had become unbearable. Their faces were plastered across news broadcasts. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse every morning, holding signs condemning racism and police brutality. The officers could hardly step outside without being met with jeers and shouts of outrage. Their families were harassed. Friends distanced themselves. The badge that had once shielded them now felt more like a target. In a last-ditch effort to salvage their case, ADA Marshall filed a motion to exclude any mention of Elisa's federal position, arguing that it was prejudicial and irrelevant to the specifics of the arrest. Judge Whitfield swiftly denied the motion. She ruled that Elisa's role in law enforcement oversight was directly relevant. Her expertise in constitutional rights and policing standards gave her legitimate cause to question the officer's actions that night. Marshall was running out of options. Through it all, Elise remained composed, though she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had never wanted to use her position as a weapon. But in a system so often stacked against people of color, sometimes the only way to break the cycle of injustice was to expose it with the full force of federal authority. Gregory continued to methodically present evidence, each new piece further discrediting the officer's versions of events. Emails revealed Ridley complaining about the influx of outsiders into certain neighborhoods, and Thompson had once shared a racially insensitive meme with colleagues. While such digital traces might not directly prove malice, they painted a damaging picture of officers who harbored deeply ingrained biases. When questioned on the stand, both men stumbled, struggling to justify their words and actions. The reaction in the courtroom was immediate. Some jurors looked horrified, while others tried to conceal their shock. Spectators in the gallery shook their heads or muttered angrily. Even the judge's calm judicial demeanor slipped occasionally, betraying her growing concern and indignation. An undercurrent of retribution seemed to flow through everything. For years, Ridley and Thompson had flaunted their power, confident that no one would hold them accountable. Now, they found themselves cornered, exposed under the harsh glare of national attention. The disgrace they had tried to inflict on Elise was now coming back to haunt them tenfold. Their credibility had crumbled, and whispers of criminal charges, perjury, civil rights violations, grew louder. Elise did not take pleasure in their downfall. She was all too aware of the bigger picture. They were merely the tip of the iceberg. The true victories would be changes in policy, accountability measures, and real cultural shifts within policing. Still, she couldn't deny a sense of closure. If even two corrupt officers could be exposed, it would send a powerful message to others that no one was above justice. As the trial neared its end, the city of Westbridge braced for the verdict. Were the officers guilty of misconduct, perjury, and racially motivated abuse of power, or would the flawed system protect them once again? One thing was certain: the illusions that had shielded them had been shattered. The final judgment loomed, promising to set a precedent for how the nation would confront similar injustices in the future. In the packed courtroom, all eyes were on Ridley and Thompson as the final days of the trial unfolded. The evidence of their wrongdoing had piled up so high that even their own counsel was running out of defenses. Rumors swirled that the officers were considering a plea deal, some arrangement to avoid the harshest penalties. Yet their pride still clung to the hope that they might escape with minimal consequences. On the stand for a second time, Officer Thompson appeared shaken. Gone was the swaggering confidence. Perspiration dripped down his temple as Gregory methodically replayed the damning surveillance footage, cross-referencing it with Thompson's earlier contradictory statements. The tension in the room was palpable, each silent second amplifying the sense that the walls were closing in on him. Ridley, watching from the sidelines, had his jaw clenched, lips pressed tight. He had always been the dominant one between the two, but now the cracks in his tough exterior were undeniable. During a brief recess, his attorney confronted him in a corner of the courtroom, whispering urgently. If they refused to show any remorse, they risked being crucified by public opinion, and possibly the law. They had become a liability, not just to themselves but to the entire Westbridge PD. When proceedings resumed, something unexpected occurred. Ridley stood, requesting a moment to address the court. Judge Whitfield, clearly intrigued, granted his request. The veteran officer cleared his throat, his eyes scanning the room before finally landing on Elise. He hesitated, as if grappling with a profound internal struggle. I want to say something," Ridley began, his voice unsteady. "I've been a police officer for nearly 30 years, and I've always tried to do my job. But I see now that I've made mistakes. Big mistakes." He turned slightly toward Elise, though he couldn't quite meet her gaze for more than a brief second. "Miss Morgan, I'm sorry," he stammered, swallowing hard. The silence was deafening. The man who had once mocked Elise, who had dismissed her as an insignificant civilian, now struggled to find the right words. "I'm sorry for handling things the way I did. I was wrong, and I apologize." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Thompson, seated beside his partner, looked stunned. Elise studied Ridley's face. Was this genuine contrition, or was it a calculated move? She decided that, while she couldn't fully read the man's heart, his words still carried weight. This was a moment in which an emblem of power had been forced to acknowledge wrongdoing. Judge Whitfield motioned for Ridley to sit, but before he could, Thompson also rose to his feet, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking slightly, I apologize as well to Miss Morgan. We messed up." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Gregory nodded softly, and Elise remained composed, meeting Thompson's gaze. She offered a dignified nod of acknowledgement, accepting their words without fully endorsing them. A public apology was far from justice, but it was a step. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, albeit subtly. Some spectators seemed relieved, while others remained unconvinced. Reverend Tillman, sitting in the gallery, breathed a measured sigh, and Karen Donahue, scribbling furiously in her notebook, prepared to write about the dramatic reversal she had just witnessed. The apology didn't erase the lies told on the stand or the racially charged remarks. Yet it laid bare the tension between personal remorse and systemic abuse. Even if these officers were sincere, the damage they had caused extended far beyond them. The city had to confront why it had allowed men like Ridley and Thompson to act with impunity for so long. Elise listened to their apologies with a calm expression. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying in the hushed courtroom. "I accept your apology, but that doesn't absolve the harm you've done. Let's hope this sparks real change." Her words hung in the air, an unspoken challenge to the entire system. As the courtroom recessed for the day, reporters scrambled for statements and the public braced for the next phase. Contrition or not, accountability was now inevitable. On the final day of the trial, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The jury filed in, their faces somber, bearing the weight of days of testimony and revelations. Elise sat quietly beside Gregory, eyes forward, posture dignified. Opposite them, Ridley and Thompson appeared to have aged years during the trial. Their once defiant demeanors had deflated. Judge Whitfield addressed the court. "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" she asked. The forewoman, a middle-aged woman with determined features, rose and handed a slip of paper to the bailiff. After a tense pause, she read aloud the words that would determine the outcome. On the key charges of false arrest and filing false reports, the jury found Ridley and Thompson guilty. They also faced potential additional charges, including civil rights violations, pending the outcome of federal investigations that Elise's team would oversee. A wave of hushed exclamations rippled through the gallery. Some spectators smiled, others allowed tears to slip down their cheeks. Ridley and Thompson lowered their heads, their attorneys placing comforting hands on their shoulders. There would be sentencing to come, but the message was clear. Their actions had consequences. Judge Whitfield's voice carried with steady authority. "Officers Ridley and Thompson, a date for sentencing will be set. Until then, you are remanded to limited custody with electronic monitoring. Given the gravity of the charges, your continued service on the police force is no longer viable. I trust the department will act accordingly. Court is adjourned." She banged her gavel, and the sound seemed to emphasize a monumental shift. Elise closed her eyes briefly, exhaling the tension that had built up over the weeks. Gregory patted her arm in quiet celebration. Immediately, the gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters clamored for quotes, cameras flashed incessantly, and the bailiffs did their best to maintain order. Ridley and Thompson were escorted out through a side door, heads lowered. They had entered the courtroom believing themselves untouchable. Now they were leaving as convicted criminals with tarnished reputations and uncertain futures. Community members gathered around Elise, offering gratitude and congratulations. Even Reverend Tillman, who had watched quietly, approached her with moist eyes. "Thank you, Miss Morgan," he said, voice trembling. "You've shown everyone that justice can still prevail." Karen Donahue, the columnist, extended a surprisingly warm handshake. "I've been critical of federal overreach in the past," she admitted, "but you showed me that there are times federal oversight is exactly what's needed." Elise accepted their thanks graciously. She felt relief not just for her personal vindication, but for what this verdict represented. For too long, stories like hers had ended with the officer's word being taken as truth, leaving victims unheard and unprotected. Today's verdict, while not erasing decades of injustice, was a beacon of hope. Gregory stood nearby, his face beaming with tired pride. Tiana, Elisa's assistant, discreetly pressed a phone into Elisa's hand. "It's Deputy Secretary Lawson," she whispered. "He wants to congratulate you." Elise smiled. She'd nearly forgotten the larger world that awaited her beyond Westbridge. With the trial concluded, she could now focus on ensuring that systemic reforms followed the verdict. This was only one battle in a larger war against discrimination and corruption, but for that moment, Elise allowed herself to savor the rare victory. The city of Westbridge, battered by scandal, had taken a stand for justice, and in doing so, had given the nation a reason to believe in the power of accountability and truth. In the weeks following the trial, Westbridge found itself under intense public scrutiny. The Westbridge Police Department announced a full overhaul of its complaint review system, promising external oversight and transparency. A federal task force, overseen in part by Elise herself, began investigating the department's leadership. Heads rolled, and retirements were hastily arranged for high-ranking officials who had stonewalled complaints. The old guard gave way to new, more diverse leadership. Ridley and Thompson awaited formal sentencing. Their attorneys pursued every possible legal angle, but the evidence was overwhelming. Meanwhile, the city braced for a civil lawsuit from Elise, one aimed at securing financial restitution not for herself, but for the underrepresented communities harmed by police misconduct. She planned to channel any award into social programs that supported youth and addressed racial disparities in law enforcement. Elisa's story captured the national spotlight. Interviews and articles highlighted her role in exposing systemic corruption. Many media outlets treated her like a celebrity, but reframed each interview to focus on the broader issue of reform. "I'm just one person," she would say. "There are countless others who've endured the same injustice with no recourse. They deserve to be heard too." At City Hall, a special ceremony took place to honor local civil rights activists who had long fought against injustice, often in obscurity. Reverend Tillman received a commendation, and Karen Donahue, once a vocal critic of activist movements, delivered a sincere apology, acknowledging her previous misguided views. The moment was laden with symbolism. People from all sides of the ideological spectrum uniting in recognition that change was imperative. Gregory Holtz, after the trial, found his law office overwhelmed with messages of support. The aging attorney, nearing retirement, joked that he might never retire if more cases like Elisa's kept arising. "We've only scratched the surface," he confided to Elise one afternoon. "Every day, more victims come forward, emboldened by your example." Tiana, Elisa's ever-dedicated assistant, coordinated resources from Homeland Security to assist Westbridge's journey toward reform. She also played a pivotal role in bringing together a coalition of local nonprofits, educators, and business leaders, all committed to revitalizing the city's marginalized neighborhoods. The collaboration was extraordinary. Where once cynicism had prevailed, a spirit of hope and collective effort began to take root. One evening, Elise returned to the now familiar street where her confrontation with Ridley and Thompson had unfolded. The elderly resident whose home had been raided greeted her with tearful gratitude. The neighborhood children, once fearful of harassment, now rode their bikes freely. Street murals began to emerge on old walls, portraying images of unity and justice. As Elise looked around, a sense of quiet satisfaction washed over her. The city still had much to overcome, but at least it was heading in the right direction. Back in her vehicle, Elise took a moment to reflect. She had arrived in Westbridge as a visitor, only to be thrust into a battle for her dignity and freedom. But from the ashes of that ordeal, something transformative had risen, not just for her, but for the city and potentially the nation. She would continue her role as head of Homeland Security, but she vowed never to forget the lesson Westbridge had taught her. That ordinary people, driven by truth and courage, could dismantle even the most deeply entrenched injustices. She leaned back against the seat, scanning the twinkling skyline. The journey ahead might be long, but the engine of change was finally in motion. And that, Elise thought with a determined smile, was a path worth traveling, no matter where it led. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of truth and redemption. We witnessed how arrogance and prejudice crumbled in the face of one woman's unwavering resolve, Elise Morgan, who refused to succumb to injustice. This story illuminates a critical truth. No matter one's rank or uniform, no one is above accountability. Equally important, it highlights the power of solidarity, where diverse voices unite to hold institutions to their highest standard. If this story moved you, we encourage you to take action. Reflect on the injustices you encounter, support those who fight for fairness, and continue advocating for change, no matter how small the step. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. By doing so, you help spread stories that inspire hope, courage, and the transformative power of justice. Together, we can ensure every voice is heard and every life is valued.